past and who has come back to enjoy this story as well. We are doing another program in August on the 19th. It's called Victoria's Secret, and it has to do with dress and style of the earlier periods of life, and should be real interesting for everyone. We have, for our opening tonight, after the program, our Maritime Room, which is kind of a pre-exposure to our grand opening. We have rooms here in the museum that are separate from the main floor, and we house a salt room, a kitchen room, a tool room, different rooms, Brenner's shoe store, and we're pleased to add on the Maritime Room, which is down here, the hallway in the corner on the end. We'd love for you to come and see it after the program. Tonight's presenter is Chuck Homburg. Many of you may have read or seen his book. Chuck is the author of the History of St.Clair book. But he's also a real interested historian for St.Clair and the St.Clair area. And any of us have questions about St.Clair, a lot of us will go back to Chuck and ask him. And he will do a great job always keeping us informed and knowing what direction to go if he's not sure. So tonight, we'd like to recognize Chuck as a presenter. Thank all of you for coming out. Weather conditions were a factor. We know that many of you did not mind that, came anyway. So thank you very much on behalf of all of the museum workers and people that are volunteers here at the museum. If you raise your hand, so everybody can see where you are, and if there's any questions, please know that we're available to help you in any way that we can. On behalf of the museum, thank you again.
Again, thanks for coming out in the rain. St. Clair County was a major shipbuilding center in the 19th century. Over 600 ships were built in the county, 65 of them here in St. Clair. Can you see Okay, shipbuilding here in St. Clair began in 1825. In that year, 2 schooners, the Grand Turk and the Pilot, were built here. And then over the next few years, several more were built. These early ones, we generally don't know a great deal about them. Likely most of them were built in a small shipyard that was located where the salt company is today. Like it was right there. And the river's here. So there was a sawmill and gristmill here, a shipyard, and a foundry. And this is the man who owned that property where the shipyard was. His name is Wesley Truesdale. He owned 4 sawmills in St. Clair and wanted to have 2 ships, so he built these 2 there, or had them built for him. He was one of those 19th century men here in St. Clair who was involved in lots of things. He came here actually as a banker, but got involved in lots of other businesses and became a major property owner. A little bit more about these 2 ships that he built. The Goliath in 1846 actually was the first ship, or supposedly the first ship on the Great Lakes to be built primarily to carry cargo. Now this says passengers, but a lot of the sources say purely for cargo. And generally they carried passengers and cargo. The Goliath was 131 feet long. It went to Lake Superior, which in 1848, that's before the locks, but it took a cargo, was taking a cargo of bricks, 20,000, which would be quite a heavy cargo for that ship. But this was a brick a manufacturing center as well. So they were taking brick up there, lumber, blasting powder, and hay. And actually, St. Clair shipped a lot of hay out of here as well, plus some other general merchandise. But up in Lake Huron, it caught fire, it exploded, and all 18 aboard died, including Captain Cottrell. Parts of it washed ashore on the Canadian side, some in the Godrich area. Oops, didn't read that. The Empire State, this was Truesdale's dream ship. It was gigantic for the time. It was almost 300 feet long and it weighed over 1,500 tons. It was so big that some of the harbors were too shallow for the ship to get into. Truesdale operated it for a short time, sold it, it was lengthened and became even a larger ship. And in 1858, however, it was scrapped and became part of a dry dock in Buffalo, New York. The most notable local shipbuilder was Simon Langille. And he had been born back in 1835 in Nova Scotia. But his family moved to Marine City when he was a very young boy. So he really grew up in Marine City, which was quite a shipbuilding center, larger than St. Clair. He did a lot of things during his life. He was a teacher, became a sailor, and then worked in a shipyard and eventually became a master carpenter and a great designer of ships. In 1864, his first ship was launched here in this shipyard, and it was the Hemisphere. A year later, he launched the Liberty. And these were fairly small ships, but he got his start. And here is Simon Langille. His portrait we have in our new Marine Room, along with his wife, Helen. In 1869, he was quite busy building several ships, and also in Marine City he was helping to get the construction of the Ketchum started. The Ketchum, which is in the picture here, was another ship that was considered really large, one of the largest on the lakes for its day. And he helped get that started in the Leicester shipyard and left a man there to complete it, Mr. Rice. In 1870, he launched the Agnes Potter into the St. Clair River, and it was the first ship to be owned by the Interocean Transportation Company, and it hauled iron ore from Escanaba to the lower lakes. And by 1869, 1870, Langille was finding this little shipyard here too small, and you had to launch the ships, kind of backwards into the river, and the preferred method was to side launch them. So he looked around for a place to build his own shipyard, and in 1872 he found that, and it was a vacant piece of property just to the west on the Pine River, the area where the St. Clair Boat Harbor is today. And he would launch them, if you can see in the old photograph on the right where that curve is. By 1873, a tug and two barges had been built in this new Langille shipyard. But 1873, well, here's one. The Wilson Transit Company was another new shipping line, and they ordered their first steamer from Langille, and it was the D.N. Wilson, 179 feet long. And most of the ships he built there were in this general range, 178, 180 feet, about there, although a few were larger. And here it is. In 1894, it sank off north of Lexington.
It didn't last very long, did it?
No, you know, some of these ships didn't last long at all. You know, in a couple of years, a boiler blew up and they caught on fire and sank, or they hit a reef or something. And then others went on for 45, 50 years. In 1874, he launched the Chancey Hurlburt. And this is a good photograph to see, what his ships look like. A lot of them are very, very similar. The pilot's house is pretty distinctive of his ships. They all pretty much look exactly like that. This one, too, was lost in a storm in Lake Superior. (1873) was the year of panic, and panic is a term that wasn't used after 1908, but it referred to a depression. And so you had a serious downturn in the economy that year, a lot of bank failures, and a lot of businesses failed. So shipping on the Great Lakes was down considerably, and no one was ordering ships. So the Langille yard wasn't going to be completed right away. He did, however, keep a lot of his workers on the job by building the Justin R. Whiting. And he built that really on speculation. He didn't have a buyer. He just built it hoping he would be able to sell it. By the late 70s, the Depression was easing, the economy coming back, business picking up, and he had gone out and found this property with a very good stand of oak on it. So he bought that oak, he went out and had his own men cut it, brought it back, and began to build the Oscoda in 1878, and got orders for 2 more steam barges. Here's another picture of the Oscoda. I think this is probably taken in Tawas or Oscoda, where it was picking up lumber. That was a big area for sawmills, and the lumber was brought down to Detroit, Cleveland, or often it went east. The Oscoda sailed the lakes for a number of years, but on November 10th, 1914, it had 2 schooners in tow, and it got stuck on a reef near St. Helens Island, which is west of St. Ignace. And it broke up over the next few days, and what was left of it sank. The captain of the Oscoda was Henry Fish, and he was a Sinclair man. This was his home on North Riverside. Captain Fish later on was the captain of the Ogama. He was the captain of the Forester, captain of a lot of ships. A number of them Sinclair built, and in fact he was a part owner in a number of ships built here. I meant to change that one, it's too slow.
It's interesting.
Yeah. The 1880s is really a booming decade, and for Simon Langille, it's his best years. He's going to build 15 wooden ships in the Langille shipyard during the 80s. And here is one of them being launched. And one under construction. Business was so good that he had a hard time finding enough skilled workers for the shipyard. So he went to Montreal and recruited French-Canadian workers to come to St. Clair, move their families here. And here's the shipyard. And these photographs probably about 1900. See the sawmill on the right. And some ships there laid up during the winter. Work went on in the winter, particularly in the interiors of some of these ships. And I think we just recently figured out that those are likely Langella, two of Langille's sons. In 1880, the schooner Melbourne was launched, and soon after it, the Middlesex. And here's a picture of the Melbourne. And these two had long careers on the lakes, nothing exciting like some of them where you had accidents and sinkings, but did their job for a number of years.
How deep is that Pine River?
I'm not really sure. Most of these ships had a draft of around 14, 15 feet. And most of them were around 34 feet wide.
They were dragging bottom.
Yeah, they were pretty close.
Yeah.
Along 2nd Street, there used to be a canal that went inland there. And some people thought, they launched ships in it. Well, they might have launched small ones, but the larger ones were launched directly into the Pine River. But here you have, some ships laid up for the winter there. I made other pictures of small boats there. Repairs likely were done there. And here you have a ship about to be launched. It is this 200 or so feet. In 1881, the Ogama was launched, and it's what they call a lumber hooker. They'd stack the lumber in there, and it could pull schooner barges, and worked for a lot of years in that business, carrying lumber. And it too burned, like a number of others. This one near St. Clair. The D.C. Whitney was launched in 1882, and it was 229 feet long, a little over 1,000 ton, and it operated until 1913 on the lakes. And this is a photograph taken in the Sioux. But again, you can see the pilot house, it's just like most of his. And an 1880s picture at his shipyard, and you can see that canal there kind of on the left. And this is the Nipigon, and two different pictures of it. It was launched in 1883. It was owned by D. Whitney of Detroit. In 1919, it became the Maple Hill, and in 1920, the Maple Grange, and was scrapped in 1925. Now I like this picture because here you can see what these lumber hookers look like, loaded with lumber. This is the Kalkaska, which was launched in '84, and it pretty much was like, the Ogama and the Oscoda and some others, about the same size, same design. In 1918, it was converted to a sandsucker down at the McClough yards. And sandsuckers literally would suck the sand from the bottom of the lake or the river. Captain Fish was its first owner. And after quite a few years on the lakes, it burned at Marine City. The Simon Langille was launched in 1886, and it's another one that he built on speculation, not having a buyer, hoping to find one, and he did. Captain Pringle of St.Clair, and later was owned by the Sinclair Transportation Company, and then the Argo, and finally Scott Meisner. And it ended its days being owned by the Langille Transportation Company. And in 1936, it burned, but there were 3 ships all tied up together, tied up to each other, and one of the others caught fire and they all burned. There's a load of coal. And this one probably is Langille's best-known ship. It's the Kali Yuga, built in 1887 for the St.Clair Steamship Company, which was a local company here. Langille was the biggest stockholder, or actually his wife Helen was. And a lot of other St. Clair and Marine City business people also own stock in this company, including Eugene Smith here at St. Clair, who was another sawmill owner, and 3 of the Baselogs, and Myron Kenyon, who was a captain and ship owner, and later on also Seneca Kenyon were stockholders.
I have a question for
Yeah.
you, Charles. What is the vessel that's on the bottom there in the foreground?
We have been debating that for a long time. We don't know what that is. It's either it looks like a sunken vessel, ship.
Yeah,
Or-
it definitely is.
And we don't know why it's there or how long. But where that is would be just about where Pepper Joe's is today.
Chuck, I'm curious, the
Mhm.
process of how they launch it
Mm-hmm.
sideways. Did they use horses or mules, ropes? They to
They took their life in their hands, I think, and knocked those
the wood supports?
Yeah.
supports
Shorty.
out.
Knock it off and
And then it just
There you go.
slides right in. And there'd be a huge wave go all across the river there. Yeah, we're debating, you see that across the river, there's, what's the term I want? Yeah, boom. That's it, thanks. A boom, and we see that in other photographs of launchings. We were talking about, what was the purpose of it? Was that just to catch all that wood and stuff that would end up in the river? And we think that's it.
makes sense.
Yeah. But the Kali Yuga was one of the largest ships on the lakes at the time. One thing I read said it was, one of the 3 largest, maybe the 3rd largest. But it was quite a ship. The St. Clair Steamship Company owned it, but Cleveland Cliffs were the managers of it. They operated it, and it was considered part of their line. 270 feet long, almost 2,000 ton. It was used, of course, since Cleveland Cliffs owned it or ran it, hauled iron ore. In 1905, we had one of those, horrendous storms on the lakes, and Lake Huron had 5 ships sink, 65 sailors died, and the Kali Yuga was one of those. Here's the Aranac, and this is a nice launch picture. The banners, the flags flying, the splash of water. In 1888, the Fontana was launched at the Langille yard, and this was a fairly large ship, but here it is at the yard. Across the river, that building is actually the Sheldon Brickyard, and it's full of bricks, and ships would come right up to that building and load bricks. So then that building would be about where the golf course clubhouse is, Pine Shores. And when you dig down in the yard there, it's brick underneath the dirt. The Fontana was 221 feet long. By 1900, it was a barge, and while being towed by the Kali Yuga, it had an accident. It collided with the Santiago just off the Fort Gratiot Lighthouse. Sank there, and for months they debated what was going to happen to this. Would a salvage company come in? Would the company that owned it, Cleveland Cliffs, or get it out of there? And it kind of went on, and finally the government just dynamited the thing out of the way. There's lots of newspaper articles about it, and you have little tidbits in kind of daily, weekly in the paper about what to do about it. Here you have the Oscar T. Flint, 1889, and it was owned by Langille, Kenyon, and Flint. And see, a lot of these people they own these as part of different partnerships, different companies. It too burned and sank in Lake Huron in 1909, so about 20 years old.
Chuck,
Mhm.
when did they stop putting the mask on the boats and just use the steam?
Well, I'm not sure how much they use sail with these as after 1900, I don't think.
What was the purpose of it? Was the purpose sails?
They use them
In
some.
case the
Both.
engine flew up or
They
something?
sometimes use both. And here's the Langille boys. It was built in 1890. And it was a 151-foot steam barge. And here it is actually at the McClough Yard in Marine City, where it underwent some rebuilding in 1920. And they actually lengthened it a bit.
You see the church?
Yeah, you see Holy Cross in the background there. In 1931, it burned and sank off Oscoda.
Chuck,
Yeah.
the boilers for these, did they bring them up to St. Clair, or did he take the ship down?
Rarely were they put in them here. Now Langille, I know at least in one of his early ships, did bring the engine here and installed it here. Generally, they were launched, the hulls were hauled usually to Detroit, and there were a couple of companies there Langille particularly liked, and they were installed in Detroit. Although I know one ship he took to Port Huron, and it was installed at the Jenks shipyard.
Were they pretty utilitarian inside? I mean, they weren't really designed for passengers.
No, these were just to haul cargo freight, and I think pretty simple.
Straw beds.
Not that simple. After 1890, the demand for wooden ships really declined, and it was really hard to sell a wooden ship. Everybody was building steel by then. So the Langille yard isn't going to do much construction in the decade of the 90s. In the early 90s, the steam yacht Penelope was launched, and also the steam ferry Welcome in 1894. Here's the Welcome. But 1893 was another of those Depression years. The Panic of '93 really, for the rest of the 1890s, meant business was way down, and so the demand for ships was down as well. The Welcome was built here to be used here. I did run across some newspaper articles recently that talked about the launching of this ship, and they called it the Sienna. But it was the Welcome they were referring to. It was owned by Bobby and Dale, who had a dock at the foot of Witherell Street, and was used here to carry freight passengers to Courtright. It also, in its earlier years, was used as an excursion boat. And it is docked there in St. Clair. And there are the binoculars. Mr. Dale's binoculars, right? Harry Dale, Captain Harry Dale. The Penelope was owned by Alex Langille of Cleveland, and he was one of the Langille sons. He was involved in the shipbuilding business in Cleveland, and he owned the Penelope, which caught fire in 1909 and sank here off the shore of Avon Lake, Ohio, which is near Lorraine. By the 90s, Simon Langille was letting his sons run the business more and more, and he was very involved civically. He was on the school board and the school on the top, the high school. He was mayor of the city, and you had the city hall on the right. And then he was also director of the Commercial and Savings Bank. And here is his home, the one on the left, which was right on the corner of South Riverside and Fort Street. And Fort Street is that street that goes back to the harbor. So if you know where Fred Moore's boathouse is, that's exactly where this house was located. And he and his wife Helen lived here for a very long time, close to the business. The last wooden steamship built at the Langille Yard and built here in St. Clair was the Alfred Mitchell. And this is one he built on speculation. He started construction in 1896. The economy wasn't real good yet. So he didn't have a buyer, and he didn't have a buyer, so just sort of gradually worked on it. Finally, he had someone purchase it, and it was launched in 1900. And it was 255 feet. In 1919, a Belgian company bought it, and it went to Europe, went to Belgium. In later years, small boats were still built here. Boats were repaired there. It's a nice photograph taken at the Langille Yard. But as Peter Vanderlinden, who was a great Great Lakes ship student, as he said, the river of wood, the pine, then gradually returned to its sleepy beginnings. This is one of his sons, John Langille, who learned the business working at the Langille Yard, but then went to Detroit and worked at the dry dock and shipbuilding departments of the Detroit Shipbuilding Company. And in later years, Ralph Langille owned the shipyard, did some work there, repaired boats, built any small boats maybe there. By the 1960s, it was abandoned. Buildings were still there. The property was owned by Diamond Crystal Salt Company. And this is what they look like. See it? On the upper right, you have the old sawmill. What those two men are looking at is the remains of a big wheel. that was used to haul the logs to the sawmill. The remaining 7 acres that Diamond Crystal owned became part of the St. Clair Boat Harbor in 1969. It opened in 1970. They purchased a few other acres from another property owner. And there were other boat builders here, mostly building small boats. Calvin Chamberlain was one, and he built that one in the lead there. And rowboats, of course, were built here too. In fact, Mr. Sibylla built 100 of them. The Columbia Ironworks opened in 1901. And this was a shipyard located just south of the city in East China on the St. Clair River, a place where St. Clair Shores Boulevard is today. A little subdivision there near the Dairy Queen. This had a group of investors who started it, including William Jenks of Port Huron, although he was born in St. Clair, but he owned the Jenks shipyard in Port Huron. And they wanted this place as, I think, a better place to launch their ships because the Jenks yard launched them into the Black River, which really limited the size of the ship and particularly the width of it. However, they got 2 boats under construction and had to sell. Who bought the company was Great Lakes Engineering Works. And Great Lakes Engineering Works had a shipyard in Detroit, a small one, and then a larger one downriver Detroit. In fact, that one is the one where the Edmund Fitzgerald was built. So the same company finished the 2 ships Columbia Ironworks had started. They became the Winnebago and the John C. Howard. Here's the launch of the Winnebago in 1903. Now the Howard we don't have a picture of, which is too bad because it has an interesting history. It sailed for only 2 or 3 years on the lakes, then was sent to California where it operated along the coast for several years. Then it went to Japan where it operated for several years, and then to China where it was used for maybe 10, 15 years and burned in Shanghai in 1930. Oops. This one too went to California but sank off the coast. This is the headquarters of Great Lakes Engineering, and the building on the left, the kind of low building on the left, is all that remains of the buildings that were there. It was quite a large complex. That was their headquarters, and there were apartments in it, and I believe now it's just a single-family home.
Two families.
It's part brick, part frame.
Where is that house located?
It's faces St. Clair Shores Boulevard, but the back of it you can see
you know
from
which one it is.
the River
Yes.
Road. Yes. 13 ships were built at Great Lakes, however. 2 were started in 1905, and they were the George H. Russell and the Frank J. Hecker. These are steel ships. Most of the ships launched there were kind of in the range of 450 feet. Some of the early ones were only about 250. Here's the George Russell. Later became the Canopus, the Hecker, and the Perseus. And both of them operated for quite a long time. Some of the workers. And some of the different crews and the different buildings there. We do have a nice collection of pictures from the shipyard. The Ashtabula was launched in 1906, and this was a car ferry that ran across Lake Erie to Canada from Ashtabula to Port Brunel. In 1958, it collided with another ship and they sank. And interestingly enough, the captain of the Ashtabula committed suicide before the Coast Guard report could be made public. The Mitchell in 1906, we have some good launch pictures of it. And the Mitchell didn't sail for long because it sank on Lake Superior west of Whitefish Point when it collided with another freighter, the William Mack. It sank in 7 minutes. Luckily only 3 of the crew members died in this. The others were saved by the Mack.
When they talk about all these collisions, because they're starting to appear like there were quite a few,
There were.
was it fog, storm?
Well, sometimes fog, sometimes a storm, sometimes just miscalculating accidents. Often they were in, places, tight places where ships were trying to maneuver. I know the St. Mary's River had, if you know where that is in the UP, it has some channels that are really narrow and winding, and there were often more collisions there. In this case, both of the captains were judged negligent. And then we have the Davit. It was launched in 1907, and it too came to a pretty bad end in a terrible storm on Armistice Day in 1940, and that's November 11th. Several ships sank in this storm too on Lake Michigan, and it had a crew of 32, and all of them died, including 2 St.Clair sailors, Edward E. Becker and Arula J. Shirkey, and 3 from Marine City, and I think 1 from Port Huron and several from Sanilac County. But that was, one of those storms that came up suddenly. It had been 60 degrees, and suddenly it was below 0, and rain turned to snow, and it was covered with ice, tremendous wind and waves. Yeah, this is an interesting thing, too, with the shipyard. The Detroit Railroad Tunnel, 11 sections of that were built here at Great Lakes Engineering. And then they were towed to Detroit, and they were then sunk into a trench in the bottom of the river, sleeves put on them to connect them, and then the trench filled with concrete.
Is this still being used?
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yes.
The Normania in 1908. We have another picture of it, but I don't know too much about it. And the Adam E. Cornelius was launched in 1908.
These are all out Sinclair?
I think these pictures here were taken just south of the Sinclair, just south of the city, or the south end of town. And these were sister ships. They think they were pretty much identical, the North Star and the North Lake. And there were 2 more that were launched there, had long careers on the lakes. And then in 1910, the Harry Yates. And I like this picture of its launch because they have the little tugboat there helping it. The Yates was owned by the American Steamship Company and managed by Boland and Cornelius until 1962, so quite a long time. In 1934, it was named the Consumer's Power, and if you notice in our marine room, we have a life ring with that name on it from the ship. We also have its binnacle is in the Marine Room. It ended its years as the Leaddale. And this is the very last ship built in St. Clair. It was the Wickwire, the Theodore Wickwire, launched that same year, 1910. And it too sailed the lakes until 1968, so it had quite a nice long career. In 1910, Great Lakes Engineering Works closed their St. Clair yard, and they moved all the machinery to Ashtabula, Ohio, where they opened this new shipyard. Ashtabula was near the steel mills, it was near the coal fields, so for building steel ships, it was in a better location. It also had what were considered pretty ideal places to launch ships. So their gain was Sinclair's loss. And very quickly, this complex of buildings were vacant, and they stood vacant for a few years. I know in 1913 they were still all intact, but not for long. And it was the end of an era here for Sinclair. So 65 ships built from 1825 to 1910. Thank you.
Thank you, Chuck. Any questions for Chuck? We have, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Was a lot of the population of the city working at the shipyards, or was it more rural than that? And
Well, I was asked before, about employment in these shipyards, and we don't have numbers. A fair number were employed, but I think it was kind of up and down. When they had one or two ships being built, they employed quite a few, but then you might have a stretch where they laid off most of them. So, as far as local workers, there were a lot of industries they worked in. In the early and mid-1800s, sawmills were a bigger industry. Throughout that century and into the 20th, brickyards was quite a big industry here. There were 4 or 5 different ones. And plus other smaller ones, woolen mills, flour mills, things like that.
were the launchings, like, all the residents came down and watched, or?
They
was it
did, they were
publicized?
spectacular. So much went into building these. The whole town was interested in the construction of these ships. And when one was launched, yes, the whole town went to watch it. So there were huge crowds, and it was, celebrations. It was like a big party for these events.
Questions? No, Chuck, thank you so much.
Well, thank you. And
As part of the museum, we have an archival area upstairs, which includes family histories, yearbooks, etc. This is a book of Langille, Simon Langille, and his family. So anyone who has connections or may wish to look something up, you may find it in this book. If not here tonight, we do keep and maintain it upstairs. The lighthouses that you see here are 2 of the lighthouses that we have used this summer. They are from Eddy Elementary, part of the 4th grade project that the students have done. And we have refreshments and some drinks, cookies, and also the Maritime Room will be open. Ron?
I'd just like to remind everybody that tomorrow evening in the park in St. Clair is the St. Clair Car Show. And the proceeds from the car show go towards the museum. So it's free admission down there. So please go down and support the folks at the car show. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ron. Our area